If I go back to the late 1990s and look at a GeForce 256, then compare it with something like an RTX 590 today, they almost feel like products from completely different industries. One was built mainly to accelerate 3D graphics. The other can render games with ray tracing, generate frames with AI, accelerate video production, run local large language models, train neural networks, and perform workloads that used to belong in expensive workstations or data centers. And yet, they belong to the same GeForce family. So today, I want to go through the evolution of NVIDIA's GeForce graphics cards, starting with the GeForce 256 and moving all the way to the RTX 50 generation. Because when you look at this history from beginning to end, you realize something interesting. NVIDIA didn't simply make graphics cards faster, it kept changing what a graphics card was supposed to be. Let's start in 1999. That was when NVIDIA launched the GeForce 256. And this card is important because NVIDIA famously described it as the world's first GPU, or graphics processing unit. Now, the term GPU sounds completely normal today, but back then, graphics hardware was often referred to as a 3D accelerator. The GeForce 256 brought more of the graphics pipeline directly onto the graphics chip, including hardware transform and lighting. That meant the GPU could handle calculations that previously placed more pressure on the CPU. For gamers, the result was better 3D graphics and higher performance. But from a historical perspective, something bigger was happening. The graphics card was starting to become its own serious processor. After the original GeForce came the GeForce 2 generation. NVIDIA increased clock speeds, improved memory bandwidth, and pushed performance forward. Then came GeForce 3 in 2001, and this is where programmable shaders started becoming really important. Before programmable shaders, graphics pipelines were much more fixed. Developers had limited control over exactly how graphics were processed. With programmable shaders, developers could start writing small programs that ran directly on the GPU. That opened the door to much more sophisticated lighting, materials, reflections, and visual effects. This was a huge step. The GPU was no longer just following a fixed set of graphics instructions. It was becoming programmable. Then came GeForce 4. And if you were gaming in the early 2000s, names like GeForce 4 Ti probably bring back some memories. The GeForce 4 generation improves performance and refinement, but NVIDIA's biggest competition was becoming increasingly serious. ATI, Radeon. Throughout the early 2000s, NVIDIA and ATI were constantly fighting for the performance crown, and NVIDIA did not win every generation. That's important to remember. The GeForce FX generation, especially the FX 5000 series, had some real problems. NVIDIA was pushing into the DirectX 9 era, but some GeForce FX cards struggled badly against ATI's Radeon 9700 and 9800 series. Performance, efficiency, and shader execution became major talking points. For a period, ATI had a very strong position. So NVIDIA's rise was not some smooth, unstoppable journey. There were moments when it absolutely looked vulnerable. But NVIDIA recovered with the GeForce 6 series. The GeForce 6800 generation helped restore NVIDIA's competitiveness and introduced important features such as Shader Model 3.0 support. Then came the GeForce 7 series. But the truly massive architectural shift happened in 2006, the GeForce 8000 GTX. For me, this is one of the most important GeForce cards ever made. The 8800 GTX introduced NVIDIA's unified shader architecture. Before this, GPUs often had separate hardware dedicated to different types of shader workloads. Some units handled vertex shading. Others handled pixel shading. The problem was that workloads were not always balanced. You could have some parts of the GPU sitting underused while another part was overloaded. Unified shaders changed that. Now the same general-purpose shader processors could handle different types of tasks depending on what the workload needed. That made the GPU much more flexible. And at the same time, NVIDIA launched something that would eventually become even more important than GeForce itself. CUDA. CUDA allowed developers to use NVIDIA GPUs for general-purpose computing. Instead of only drawing graphics, the GPU could now perform scientific calculations, simulations, image processing, and eventually machine learning. At the time, most gamers didn't care. They were looking at frame rates. But NVIDIA was quietly building the software foundation that would later give it a huge advantage in artificial intelligence. After that came the GeForce GTX era. The GTX 200 series pushed performance further. Then Fermi arrived with the GTX 400 and GTX 500 generations. Fermi was ambitious. It was designed not only for graphics but also with general-purpose computing in mind. but some of those cards became famous for high power consumption and heat. Still, the direction was clear. NVIDIA was thinking about the GPU as more than a gaming chip. Then came Kepler with the GTX 600 and 700 series. Kepler improved efficiency and helped NVIDIA become much more competitive in performance per watt. Cards like the GTX 680 became extremely popular. Then NVIDIA introduced Maxwell. This gave us parts of the GTX 700 series and later the GTX 900 family. The GTX 970 and GTX 980 became some of the most recognizable cards of their time. Maxwell focused heavily on efficiency. NVIDIA was learning how to get more performance without simply throwing more power at the problem. And then, in 2016, we got Pascal. The GTX 10 series. This is one of the generations that a lot of PC gamers still talk about with nostalgia. The GTX 1060, 70, the GTX 1080, and of course, the GTX 1080 Ti. The 180 Ti became almost legendary. For years, it remained surprisingly capable. It had strong performance, a large amount of memory for the time, and excellent longevity. Pascal felt like NVIDIA had found an extremely strong balance between performance, efficiency, and value. And for many gamers, this was the peak of the traditional GTX era. But then NVIDIA made another major change. In 2018, it introduced the RTX 20 series, and the branding changed from GTX to RTX. That was not just marketing. RTX represented a new direction. The Turing architecture introduced dedicated RT cores for ray tracing and tensor cores for AI-related calculations. Real-time ray tracing had been discussed for years, but it was considered too computationally expensive for normal gaming. NVIDIA wanted to change that. Cards like the RTX 280 and RTX 280 Ti could accelerate ray tracing workloads in hardware. But when RTX first launched, the reaction was mixed. There weren't many ray-traced games. Performance could drop dramatically when ray tracing was enabled. And the cards were expensive. A lot of gamers with the RTX and basically asked, "Why am I paying for this?" And that criticism was understandable. But RTX introduced another technology that would become incredibly important. DLSS, Deep Learning Supersampling. DLSS used AI to reconstruct a higher resolution image from a lower resolution render. The idea was simple but powerful. Instead of brute force rendering every pixel at full resolution, let the GPU render fewer pixels and then use AI to recover detail. The first version of DLSS was not perfect, but NVIDIA kept improving it. And this is important because it marked the beginning of a major change in graphics. Performance was no longer only about traditional rendering power. AI was becoming part of the graphics pipeline. Then came Ampere and the RTX 30 series. This was when RTX started becoming much more convincing. The RTX 3080 offered a major jump in performance. The RTX 3090 pushed into an even more extreme category with 24 GB of VRAM. Ray tracing improved. Tensor performance improved. DLSS improved, and suddenly RTX no longer looked like just an experimental feature. It looked like the future NVIDIA had been betting on. The RTX 30 generation also became important for another reason that NVIDIA probably didn't originally design GeForce around: AI. People started using consumer GPUs for machine learning, stable diffusion, large language models, voice models, and all kinds of generative AI workloads. And the RTX 3090 became especially valuable because of its 24 GB of VRAM. For gaming, 24 GB was excessive for many people. For AI, it was incredibly useful. A gaming graphics card had suddenly become a personal AI accelerator. Then came the RTX 40 series with the Ada Lovelace architecture. The RTX 4090 became one of the fastest consumer GPUs ever released at the time. It was extremely powerful for gaming. But again, AI was becoming more and more important. Tensor cores were no longer something only AI researchers cared about. They were now powering gaming features directly. DLSS evolved beyond simple upscaling. With DLSS 3, NVIDIA introduced AI-generated frames. This was a huge conceptual shift. The GPU was no longer only rendering frames. AI could now create additional frames between traditionally rendered ones. That immediately created controversy. Some people said generated frames were not real frames. Others cared more about the actual experience and the higher apparent frame rate. But whether you loved it or hated it, one thing was obvious. AI was becoming deeply integrated into gaming graphics, and NVIDIA was pushing this direction very aggressively. At the same time, the generative AI boom exploded. Chatbots, large language models, AI image generation, AI coding, AI video. Suddenly, GPU demand was no longer driven mainly by gamers and professional graphics users. AI became one of the biggest forces in the entire semiconductor industry. And this is where NVIDIA's earlier investment in CUDA became incredibly important. By this point, CUDA had existed for well over a decade. Researchers had built huge amounts of AI software around it. Frameworks supported it. Libraries were optimized for it. Developers were familiar with it. So when generative AI demand exploded, NVIDIA didn't just have fast hardware. It had an entire software ecosystem waiting. And that ecosystem became one of the biggest reasons NVIDIA GPUs became so dominant in AI. Now we arrive at the RTX 50 generation. The RTX 50 series continues this trend where graphics and AI are becoming harder to separate. The modern GeForce card is no longer simply a device that takes 3D geometry and turns it into pixels. It is increasingly a hybrid computing platform. Traditional rasterization is still there. Ray tracing is there. AI reconstruction is there. Frame generation is there. Video processing is there. Creator acceleration is there. And local AI inference is there. That is a massive transformation when you compare it with the GeForce 256. The GeForce 256 was impressive because it moved transform and lighting calculations away from the CPU. Today we're talking about a GeForce GPU running an entire large language model locally. That difference is incredible. And if you look at the evolution generation by generation, you can see several distinct stages. First, the GPU became a dedicated 3D graphics processor. Then it became programmable. Then shaders became unified. Then CUDA turned it into a general-purpose parallel computer. Then dedicated tensor hardware made AI workloads faster. Then RT cores made real-time ray tracing practical. Then AI became part of the graphics pipeline itself. And now AI is becoming one of the GPU's primary workloads. This is why I think NVIDIA's history is so interesting. It wasn't just a story of increasing transistor counts. It was a story of expanding responsibilities. Every few years, NVIDIA asked the GPU to do something it didn't do before. And each time that worked, the GPU became more important inside the computer. There's also another side to this story: VRAM. If you look at GeForce cards from the early days, graphics memory was measured in megabytes. Today, high-end cards have tens of gigabytes. And VRAM is no longer only used for textures, frame buffers, and geometry. For AI users, VRAM determines what size model you can run. This completely changes how some people shop for graphics cards. A gamer might look at frame rate first. Someone running local AI might ignore a small FPS difference and immediately ask how much VRAM the card has. That's why cards like the RTX 3090 remain surprisingly attractive even after newer generations appeared. 24 gigabytes of VRAM gives you options. You can run larger models. You can use higher resolution image generation. You can run more demanding AI workloads. In a strange way, AI has changed what makes an old GPU valuable. And I think that trend is only going to become stronger. There's another thing that has changed dramatically: power consumption. Early GeForce cards look almost tiny by modern standards. Many didn't require huge cooling systems or massive external power connectors. Today, high-end GPUs are enormous. Some take up 3 or 4 expansion slots. They use huge coolers. They consume hundreds of watts. They can weigh several kilograms. A flagship GPU today is almost a computer inside your computer. And that tells us something about how central GPU performance has become. We're willing to dedicate enormous amounts of silicon, power, cooling, and money to this one component because so many modern workloads depend on it. Gaming is still a major reason, but now it's also AI. Video, rendering, simulation, content creation, scientific computing, and increasingly, personal AI. If I had shown someone in 1999 a modern RTX system running a local language model and told them this was the future of the graphics card, I'm not sure they would have believed me. And what makes NVIDIA's position especially powerful today is that hardware is only half the story. A competitor can build a fast chip. That's difficult, but possible. The harder part is building the software ecosystem around it. CUDA has been developing for years. AI frameworks support NVIDIA hardware extremely well. There are optimized libraries for inference. There are tools for developers. There are enormous communities built around NVIDIA GPUs. So when someone wants to run local AI on Windows or Linux, NVIDIA is often the easiest recommendation. Not because every NVIDIA GPU is perfect, not because NVIDIA is always the best value, but because the ecosystem works. And that software advantage traces all the way back to decisions NVIDIA made during the GeForce 8 era. That's why I think the GeForce 8000 and CUDA were arguably as important to NVIDIA's future as RTX itself. Without that early investment in general-purpose GPU computing, NVIDIA might still be a major gaming company today, but it might not have become the center of the AI hardware boom. So when I look at the full journey from GeForce 256 to RTX 50, I don't just see 30 years of faster graphics cards. I see the GPU gradually escaping from graphics. The GeForce 256 helped define the GPU. GeForce 3 made it more programmable. The GeForce 8800 helped turn it into a flexible parallel processor. CUDA opened the door to general-purpose computing. Pascal perfected the traditional GTX gaming formula. Turing introduced RTX, ray tracing, and dedicated AI hardware. Ampere made RTX much more practical. Ada pushed AI-generated graphics even further. And the RTX 50 generation continues moving toward a world where AI is deeply integrated into what the GPU does. And that raises an interesting question. What will a graphics card even mean 10 years from now? Will we still think of it mainly as something that renders games? Or will the GPU become the personal AI processor sitting inside almost every high-performance computer? Because if NVIDIA's history teaches us anything, it's that the definition of a GPU never stays the same for very long. In 1999, GeForce was about accelerating 3D graphics. Today, RTX can accelerate graphics, ray tracing, video, neural networks, and large language models. And that might be the biggest change of all. The GeForce story started with the question, how do we make computer graphics faster? 30 years later, the question has become much bigger. How much of modern computing can we move on to the GPU?